I'm David Myers, a Hope College social psychologist, and I'm here on behalf of the Holland and Climate Collaborative to interview my distinguished colleague, Professor Stephen Bomer-Prediger, uh, who is not only a member of the religion department, but also my next door neighbor, I'm proud to say. Steve is a graduate of Hope College who went on to do a Master of Divinity at Fuller Seminary, a PhD in Religious Studies at University of Chicago. He's been a professor at North Park University, and now for the last quarter century and a little more, a professor here at Hope College, where he's won multiple accolades and awards for both his teaching and his scholarship. So, Steve, I thought I'd start just by asking you your life story. How did you get from being a math computer science major back in the late 1970s to somebody who's written books about earth keeping and creation care?
That's a very interesting question, and you're not the first person to ask me that. It's a combination of things. I got a good liberal arts education at Hope College, including taking a social psychology course from you. As you probably long forgotten me, but I don't forget that class. It was mind-changing in many ways, and lots of other courses in religion, philosophy, even though I was, as you say, a math computer science major. But probably the biggest factor was working at a Reformed Church in America church camp called Camp Manitoqua, south of Chicago, the summer before my senior year at Hope. Paul Ransford, himself a Hope graduate, the director, asked me for reasons I've never figured out because I have no experience at that time in leading wilderness trips, asked me to co-lead a wilderness canoeing trip in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness of northeastern Minnesota. And I fell in love with canoeing and with wild places. And for 4 years, 1980 through 83, was the leader of an organization called Wilderness Adventures, which was formed in the Reformed Church America, Michigan area, Michigan Synod. And I led wilderness trips all over the country: Colorado, Rockies, North Carolina, the Smoky Mountains, Boundary Waters, bicycling, canoeing, backpacking.
This was while you were still a student?
I was a graduate student.
Yeah, a graduate student.
Yeah, in the summers. I'd come home for 2 years in Toronto and then California, right, and I'd lead wilderness trips all summer. And that was probably the most influential factor. It forced me to reread the Bible, to reinterpret the Christian tradition, and it put me on a path which I didn't realize at the time in terms of my scholarship. When it came to choosing a dissertation topic at the University of Chicago in the late 80s, I chose Ecological Theology and Ethics. My first book, The Greening of Theology, was a revised version of my doctoral dissertation. So my career the last 30 years as a scholar and a teacher has been shaped by that summer long ago of being a camp counselor and leading a wilderness trip.
And yet some people might hear you talking about earth keeping and creation care and say, hold it. We are the children of God. We are the apex of creation. Genesis 1 says, God bless them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over it. Isn't there, aren't we, isn't the creation there for us to enjoy, even exploit for our own good use? And then I kind of relates to a broader question. I mean, taking that kind of thinking to heart, has the church sometimes been a problem rather than the solution when it comes to creation care?
Those are both great questions, and I'll start with the latter. And the answer is simply and honestly yes, the church has been a problem. Indeed, all religions have in various ways aided and abetted the exploitation of our home planet. But also all religions, including Christianity, have tremendous resources, often unknown to people in that very tradition, resources that teach us that we ought to be caretakers and what I call earth keepers. The Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition, for example, those texts you referred to, that's the classic text that everyone often cites, Genesis 1:26 through 28, where we're called to, translation, subdue and have dominion. But just next door in Genesis 2, we are Adam because we're made from the Adamah, earth creatures made from the earth. And in Genesis 2:15, what I call the Chicago cop car verse, because that's written on the side of every Chicago police car, we're called to serve and protect, or protect and serve, avad and shamar creation. So we're given this this task in Genesis 2, which I take it as a way of further specifying what it means to exercise dominion. Dominion does not mean domination, even though many Christians have interpreted that text in that way. Dominion means serving and protecting. So that means, yes, there is use value to other creatures. I mean, we need clothing, we need to eat, but the created world isn't just valuable because of its utility or usefulness to us. It's valuable in and for itself. It has what ethicists call intrinsic or inherent value. And as Christians, we say it's valuable simply because God made it. Even if we weren't here, if Homo sapien didn't exist, the world would still be an incredibly valuable place because it's valuable to God. So we ought to complement our sense of creation being useful to us with the sense that it's valuable irrespective of its usefulness to us. So
that's a biblical theology that kind of underlies earth keeping and creation care. Can we take it in a more practical direction? What has the church actually done, either to undermine creation care, or in practical ways, what has it done and what can it be doing to support it?
Yeah, well, that's another great question. Again, there are sins here of both omission and commission. And before I forget, let me just a little quick plug here. There's a whole series of books published in the last 25 years by Harvard University Press. Here's the one on Christianity and Ecology. It's 450 pages long, but there are also books on Islam and ecology, Judaism and ecology, Taoism, Confucianism, Hinduism, indigenous traditions and ecology. There's this whole series, it's 10 books long, where you can dive deeply into this issue to answer precisely this question. Essays by scholars who talk about how Christianity or Islam or Judaism has contributed to our ecological problems and the degradation of the planet, but also, and here's the main point, the ways in which that religious tradition can help us take better care of creation. One example being the one I just gave you, of reading Genesis 2 with Genesis 1. And if you're a Jew, that's the Hebrew Bible, a Christian, the Old Testament, and taking that seriously. Or to look at the last book of the Bible, the book of the Apocalypse or Revelation, which no one reads, but everyone thinks they understand. The last 2 chapters of Revelation talk about God's good future as being a renewed heaven on earth. Heaven comes down to earth. We don't go to heaven. And God's good future is of flourishing of all creation, all creatures, in this kind of heaven on earth or earth in heaven, call it what you will. So the Bible begins and ends. I've never heard a sermon. I'm still waiting on this one. I've preached it, but I've never heard another. The Bible begins and ends with rivers and trees. Rivers and trees. First 2 chapters of Genesis, last 2 chapters of Revelation. So that's simply hinting at one of the ways in which, if we would reread the Bible with a kind of attentiveness to creation, we would see that there's much more in Scripture and much more in the Christian tradition, besides Francis of Assisi in the 13th century. There's much more there that could help us as Christians be motivated to take better care of creation.
You know, that's a beautiful vision and beautifully stated, Steve. But I want to take you from the ivory tower and bring you down to the streets here in Holland, Michigan, because we're having this conversation at the invitation of the Holland Climate Collaborative. So what does this say about the moral responsibility of government and even our local government as we sit here not many miles from a coal-producing power plant on Lake Michigan just north of us? Where does that lead us in practical terms?
That's a great question. Let me just back up a little bit before I answer that. I'm looking at a New York Times article just a week ago that it acknowledges what I've been tracking, that scientists have said that the year 2020 is a tie with 2016 as the hottest year on record. And in fact, the 10 hottest years since we've been taking careful measurements back to 1880, in 140 years, the 10 hottest years have been the last 11 years. Now put that in conjunction with email I just got from my old friend Jim Hansen, who is the leader director of the Goddard Institute for Space
Oh,
Studies
wow.
at
Yeah.
Columbia University. We met years ago at a gathering of climate scientists and evangelical Christians.
He was a prophet early on.
He was. He's now retired, but he has a blog post and email. I'm on his email list. And he's quoting his 10-year-old grandson, Connor. And there's a picture of Connor and Jake with cowboy hats on in this email. And this is just 13th of January, 2021. He quotes his grandson, Connor, "If we keep doing what we're doing now, then the environment will be ruined when the people who are kids are now grown-ups. And unless we can figure out how to make a time machine that actually works, there will be no way to go back in time to fix it." And here's the line that struck me from Jim Hanson's 10-year-old grandson. "It's not fair that the grown-ups now are ruining the atmosphere for the grown-ups in the future." End quote. And that goes
That
along.
reminds me of a concept that's very appropriate to the pandemic right now. We're asking young adults to mask up, socially distance, and so forth, even though they're at minimal risk. But we're asking them to do that not only for their own sake, but to protect those of us who are older from the community spread. And in return, what they need from us is to protect them from what's not likely to endanger me as an almost 80-year-old, but them. And so this is a form of intergenerational altruism. I need to care for their future welfare, even as they are now doing it for me on my campus by all masking up and so forth.
Exactly. It's a great point. And you just mentioned one of the terms, intergenerational
altruism.
Altruism. Well, the term that's been, that I run into in my reading literature is intergenerational justice.
Yes.
Here's a good example of intergenerational equity or justice. The 10-year-old kid who's saying, "Hey, wait, it's not fair." There's the claim, right? It's unjust to be left with a planet that you, Grandpa, and your generation have trashed. And now my generation, as I grow up, I have to deal with the consequences of what you left for us. Which is sort of the flip side of one of the most powerful arguments I've found in giving talks all over literally the world, but especially in churches. When I talk to a group of church folk, especially older folk in the crowd, I have a whole list of 10 reasons to care for creation. And the one that I find often most compelling is the future generations argument. Right. The grandparents in the room all want to say, I want the world to be a better place for Connor and, Crystal and my grandchildren.
Exactly. So, well, our time's about up, but let me just close by asking you, you're speaking of the church, what can the church do? And I'm also wondering, is there any word of hope for the future, or are you really gloom and doom?
That's a great question, and one that almost always comes up in any talk. And there's a lot the church can do. We Christians as individuals and individual members of churches, as denominations. I was on a Zoom call yesterday in the Theology Commission. We're actually talking about some of these issues there. But I go back to something, and you maybe have forgotten this, but you sent me, literally tore out a page from journal Science, June 2018, a little editorial by Catherine Hayhoe, who I know, again, from my travels in the evangelical climate care world. And she identifies apathy and despair as two of the most dangerous things today. Let me just read a small quote. "Sadly, the most dangerous myth that many people have bought into is, quote, 'It doesn't matter to me.' And the second most dangerous myth is there's nothing I can do about it." And she goes on to basically debunk both of those myths. This sense that this doesn't matter, I can be apathetic or indifferent to this, and that there's nothing I can do about it. To the first myth, I usually ask this question: how many of you breathe? And I ask for a show of hands in a classroom or an audience when I'm speaking. And of course, everyone's hand goes up and they wonder why. And I said, well, then you ought to thank a tree. After this talk is over, go hug a tree, because trees, among other organisms, provide us with the oxygen that we need, that every cell in our body needs in order to survive. Or better yet, go hug some algae in the local lake, because a lot of that oxygen doesn't come from terrestrial trees, it comes from the oceans and organisms in the ocean. And so we ought not be apathetic. We have self-interested reasons, let alone altruistic reasons like caring for the earth because of our grandchildren. There are lots of good reasons not to be apathetic, and despair too. Many people say, you know, this is a huge problem. Global climate change truly is a global problem. And the danger is that we give up hope, which is what despair means etymologically, desperare. But we're not at a point, the scientists tell us, we could be soon, but we're not at a point of no return. There are many things that we can do, again, individually, in our churches, in our local communities, and at larger levels like our government. And as a Christian, we believe in that good future, that we are called to bear witness to that good future, even if it looks dark and gloomy. We're still called, regardless of the consequences, to bear witness to God's good future of shalom, regardless of what the future may look like from what, you know, people say. It looks dark, but we're called to be people of hope. And those of us at Hope College, of all places, ought to be espousing this disposition of hope.
Stephen Bowman-Prediger, you bring honor to Hope College. I like to think you bring honor to 12th Street. Thank you for being a prophet, and keep on with your work.
Thank you very much.
God bless.
You too.